Good morning. We're going to be moving on to Daniel 7 this morning. This is where the ride begins to get interesting, and we're into the second half of the book. It's the apocalyptic side, so if you thought it was fairly normal up to now, it's going to get weird. And as long as we can be okay with that, that's fine. Part of the fun of looking at a lot of these books that we're looking at is that we get to mull them over and chew them over in a way that perhaps normally on a Sunday we might not. So I'm going to read you Daniel 7 and then we'll get properly into it. But before, let me just remind you, as we're entering apocalyptic literature, this is kind of generally written for an oppressed people or people that are suffering. And the idea is that it's comforting and it gives you kind of a view of effectively like the veil's been drawn back between heaven and earth. So you get a view of heavenly reality and what's going on amidst earthly suffering, and finding our place effectively then within God's kind of history and God's timeline and the reality of heaven itself. So that's what's happening here. Chapter 7 has been talked about by various commentators as the most important chapter of the book of Daniel. So this might take a little longer than normal because we'll make sure we look at it properly. But the idea being, a recurring theme through the whole of Daniel is that God is in charge. There might be opposition, but God is always in charge. That's always the way through Daniel. And Daniel 7 is where that really comes through very strongly. But it's all dreams and visions and things. So it's going to be fun. So let's read it. Daniel 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of this dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were 4 winds of heaven churning up a great sea. 4 great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair on his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and his wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him for the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favour of the saints of the Most High, and that time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, and it will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them another king will arise, different from the earlier ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try and change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole of heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So, hopefully you enjoyed a bit of Apocalypse. There's more in the next few chapters. Obviously, there's a lot that we can't just go into because this could be, lectures and lectures and lectures and lectures. And I think it's important to recognise with this kind of apocalyptic, poetic, imagery-rich stuff, that actually the way we read it has to be slightly different. It's like going into a library and reading poetry in the same way as you would read a journalism report. You wouldn't do it, so neither should we with this. The thought is much more fluid, and the imagery is much more kind of fluid throughout. So, for example, we talk about kings in one places, but kingdoms in another. But there's kind of the same thing, really. A kingdom has a king and that kind of thing. But also, we always tend to look for kind of a one-to-one correspondence. What does this mean? This country, and this country, or that kind of thing. And actually, our correspondence is probably not as simple as that. This is more fluid, and so we talk with prophetic stuff and apocalyptic stuff, maybe about echoes, maybe about ripples, maybe about a correspondence then, but also then, but also then. So you just go with this. It'll raise more questions, but it'll give you a flavour. So we'll talk through it. Keep remembering though, God is in charge. Okay? So the 4 beasts come out of the sea. That's interesting because the sea is quite often this symbol of chaos in the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. So for something to arise from the sea, it's kind of just arisen. There's no particular reason necessarily for it. It just kind of, these kingdoms have arisen. They've not, that's just out of this kind of chaotic world that they've arisen from. There's obviously 4 kingdoms, and anyone who's been listening to this series will recognise there's a parallel with chapter 2, which you've probably been thinking about a bit anyway. That was the one with the statue made of the 4 different substances, where Babylon was the golden head, but then we had potentially 4 different kingdoms, and a rock was torn out and basically blew up the whole thing. And we've obviously got parallels with that here, so you can cast your mind back. We're returning to chapter 2 a little bit. The lion is therefore the golden Babylon, but then there's all these other beasts, and then there's this 4th beast. And if you remember in the statue, there was a 4th clay iron divided set of feet, and that was where. So we've got the first one, the lion. That's Babylonian imagery has lions in it, so that's fair enough. And then these feet. And we thought in chapter 2 of different ways in which this could be interpreted. For example, there was one way of thinking that ended up with the 4th set, the feet, being the Greek Empire. Or there was a way of thinking about it that made the Roman Empire the feet, the clay and iron and the divided kingdom. And there was a way of thinking that which basically kind of excluded all that and sat above it as a way of thinking that it was all about idolatry and nations in a more general sense. And we're going to carry on with those themes here. So, for example, the fourth beast could be the Greek Empire. Weirdly enough, from Alexander the Great, you can count kings in a certain way, and you end up with 10 kingdoms before you get to somebody called Antiochus, who is the 11th king after Alexander. And he launched the first ever kind of proper anti-Jewish national program in history. And so that could well be what kind of sparked this Daniel oppression, if you like. You've got this king who's trying to wipe the Jews out, basically. And this is that oppressive suffering that gives rise to an apocalyptic literature where we talk about God being sovereign and God being in charge. So it could well be that. It could be to do with the Romans. It could be Daniel looking forward to the time where, Jesus comes in the Roman Empire. And it could be more to do with the end of time and that kind of thing, where, God will in some way right the wrongs where all the kingdoms. So we have, potentially the Babylonian and the Greeks and then the Romans, but also this idea there being four kingdoms. The Bible often talks about the four corners of the earth, the four winds, we could just be talking here about the kind of global kingdomness, if you like, and how all kingdoms are underneath God in authority. And so, you end up thinking in more than one way. And that's what I'm saying about this correspondence, that yes, you can argue happily about historical correspondence, but actually there's more to this, and there's echoes. And so we can talk about the Babylonians, we can talk about the Greeks, we can talk about Antiochus, but we can also talk about the Romans, and we could probably also then talk about any Christian persecution down the line, and the end of days when God shows himself to be judge. In chapter 2, there was this stone cut out and it smashed up the statue. In this one, we hear about this Son of Man figure that crops up, and it basically, when all the beasts are destroyed, the Son of Man is given this authority and the dominion over the world instead. And again, you can try and identify that. And if you've identified the Romans as the fourth kingdom, then probably going to go with Jesus. If you identified the Greeks with it, the first with the fourth kingdom, then probably you're going to go to Antiochus. And then probably your Son of Man imagery is going to be much more the people of Israel, or the saints and the martyrs. And actually that can encompass all of that. So you could have various, again, echoes of this down through history. This is weird literature, and it's a different way of reading, and we're not used to it. But that's how it is. Importantly, though, the saints are being defeated. That's the way this vision is working. There's these beasts, and particularly this one with the horn, it's defeating the saints. And then suddenly the Ancient of Days, which is again a phrase which is difficult to get a hold of, but it's kind of the one who endures, but it's shorthand for God himself. He overturns this. The beasts are destroyed and dominion is given to the Son of Man. Parallel with the stone in chapter 2, where it just smashes these kingdoms of the earth to pieces and then rises to become an eternal kingdom of its own. I'm looking at my notes because it's complicated. So we have this Ancient of Days, the one who endures. The Son of Man imagery, therefore, is talking about majesty and judgment. There's always judgment when the Bible talks about the Son of Man. There's something about him coming with the clouds. There's a big debate about whether there's a downward coming from heaven with the clouds or coming to heaven with the clouds, and that makes a big difference to how people think about it. The fact is that the language doesn't really say, but what it probably means is this most people think it's coming from, because it fits in with the context of the rest of the story. So this is a human, fully human. Now you'll hear echoes of Jesus in that when we insist that he is fully human and fully God. There's echoes of Jesus in this, but there's also echoes then of the saints and the martyrs and the people of Israel in general as the God people. There's the Son of Man comes in glory. It's in some ways a transcendent figure. It doesn't remain human. Well, it does remain human, but it's not mortal in that way. And it's very kingly. There's this sense of it being given dominion and being given the kingdoms of the earth. So all this is in play here, and it would be sad to lose some of that richness of imagery in a quick jump to Jesus and the Romans, although that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that interpretation, and it is absolutely valid. But it's good to appreciate what's going on here as well, because this was written for the Jews, for the Israelites, for the people who were under pressure at the time. And they were looking forward to a day where things would be different, but they wouldn't necessarily, it would have blown their mind how that might have played out. But this is what they were doing, is able to look forward. So there's something in this vision about knowing your place in history, and that giving kind of a colour to the dull black anguish that goes on in persecution, which might well have been this persecution by Antiochus, that enables them to kind of give words to what's going on. There's something about apocalyptic literature like this vision that enables you to look for God's goodness, because you know it's coming, so you're watching for it. And there's something about trusting in God's sovereignty over the whole thing. And all that plays out in this vision. And this vision is therefore important for us at the moment. As I keep saying, with this coronavirus, it's important for us to know that God is in charge. And like for the people it was written to, it might have seemed far-fetched at the time when they were being, persecuted in lots of really bad ways. But actually, it was really important for them to know that God was in charge. It's important to know that they need to be looking for God's goodness. There is something about the watchman looking for the morning that's in the Old Testament. And this apocalyptic literature, it allows us, even in a kind of coronavirus lockdown, to be looking for the goodness of God as it comes, looking for that first streak of the dawn. That's really important. And we can do that in ways that other people can't, because God is sovereign. And that gives us a hope and an expectation that goodness will appear. And it's all because we now know our place in history, having read the apocalyptic literature, and whether that's about a particular Greek or Roman Empire, whether it's about a particular figure. I mean, as a Christian, Jesus is in this. But because of that, it gives us our hope. But also because of this interpretation that, it's four corners of the world, all kingdoms are under and subject to God's authority and sovereignty in the end. And that includes kingdoms run by viruses, there is nothing that means we cannot trust God's sovereignty, know our place in history, and therefore look forward to the day when his goodness will come. And when we find that, we may be one of those saints and martyrs who are there up, as part of the crowd up in the heavenly courtroom, as it's pronouncing it, or maybe we'll be here on earth, watching for the dawn. But either way, because this is the heavenly sweep of history, we have this hope. So I hope you don't feel like I've down the kind of Jesus-ness of this passage, because it is truly there. It's obvious. The Son of Man comes and is given dominion. It's like the chapter 2, the stone which smashes everything else. Jesus is now king over all things, and he's king now, but he'll be more king later. That's a very complicated theological thing, but basically says it's now and not yet. That Jesus' kingdom has come, but it's also coming. And that is all part of this as well. But hopefully I'll give you enough to kind of mull over. As I said, it's complicated. It's not what we're used to reading. It doesn't follow through on a neat little one-to-one correspondence. But it is important to wrap our heads around it. And it gives us a lot more to think about during the day than a nice little parcelled up little box for you. So I'm going to leave you to think about it. If at any point any of this raises questions, then send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer questions if I can. Let me pray for you. Lord God, thank you that you are in charge, that you are sovereign, that you have defeated and that you will defeat all that oppresses your people. We pray particularly in the time of coronavirus that you would help us to be people that look for the dawn, trusting that you are over all and that you are the King of Kings, that you have established Jesus as the Son of Man, as the one who has dominion over all things. So we pray that we would be those people that would watch for your goodness coming and know our place in your history. Amen. Have a good day.